Hello, these are flipped notes 3-6 as part of Unit 3 on sensation perception. And we've made it to the perception part of the unit, perception and Gestalt. My Bitmoji is doing a little bit of magic because a lot of what magic is how we perceive things. And that we have the ability to change our perceptions. And sometimes what we can't see, that illusion, is what makes things in magic seem to look very real. The image that we've had here on so many of our flipped notes already of the vase and also faces. Hopefully you can see both by now. The reason we can see both is because of the way perception works in our brain. So let's get into it. So with sensation, that was the raw data coming in as sensory stimuli from the environment. So we've talked about how all that gets into our brain and how our brain starts to process that. Well, once your brain starts to make sense of it, that is the perception half of sensation perception. So it's how our brain is interpreting the sensory information and turning it into something meaningful based on what we already know about the real world. Some people actually have a very special ability called synesthesia, in which when they perceive a sensory, or whenever they receive a sensory stimuli, it actually affects them in more than one way. So, for example, if they see a color, they may detect a flavor in their mouth, or if they hear a sound, that they also see a color at the same time. So they're getting more than one sensory cognitive pathway being stimulated at a time. They're called synesthetes. And we'll watch a TED Ed about that during class. So much of what happens with perception actually has to do with our own experiences or predispositions to perceive things in a certain way, our perceptual set. It could be based on our own culture, our experiences, the environment we're in at that moment, just things that have happened to us recently. All of that can change the way we perceive something. So if I said to look at this drawing here on the left for just a moment, and I said, think circus. Would that change what you see? Maybe when I say circus, you can see a seal balancing a ball on his nose, maybe a ringmaster holding some kind of a cane. But what if I said, think of a fancy ballroom gala or a dance? Then perhaps that would change your perception, and maybe you see a woman and she's kind of like in this old fashioned ball gown that's got a bustle or that's like extra fabric over by her back end, and a guy, still kind of the ringmaster guy, but a guy in a fancy suit. And so by changing what I said to think about when you see the picture, that could change your perception of it. So that's all part of perceptual set. We actually talked about perceptual set when we listened to music with subliminal perception, looking for subliminal messages. That was called backmasking, where we listened to some of those songs and you couldn't hear anything, but when I said, listen for something bad, or once you saw the words on the screen of what was supposed to be in the music, then you would say, oh, I can kind of hear that now, that it affected your perceptual set. So your predisposition to perceive things in a certain way. So you can already tell that perception is an active process, meaning you can perceive things in more than one way. And even from moment to moment, the way you're thinking about it or the stimuli of the sensory things in the environment can change your perception of an event, or even changing your background knowledge. How many times, did somebody tell you something about a person? And then when you thought about it some more, now it changes your perception of that person, about what you already know. So our brain is doing this constantly. Our brain puts together different sensory information in order to try to form something orderly. Our brain doesn't like it when it has an incomplete picture. This idea that the brain wants a whole, not just parts, is called Gestalt. And Gestalt psychology is this whole kind of little subset of psych of studying why do we see things as a whole instead of trying to see things in bits and pieces. There are 6 main Gestalt principles that we'll look at of how our brain is able to perceive whole images. And the first one is called figure ground. Figure is what we see in the front, and then ground refers to the background. And our brain tends to try to organize things that way, that we can see something in the front, and then we can also see something in the background. So the figure is the thing that's being looked at in the foreground, and the ground is the background. So for example, here, if I say look for the faces, the dark faces looking towards each other, that becomes the figure. And then you just have white as the background. If I said to focus on the white part, that looks like a candlestick or a vase, that becomes the figure, and the black shadow becomes the ground or the background. So most things that we look at are not going to be as undefined as that. That when you look at pictures, you can see, just looking at me, that I am the figure and the bookcase and the cabinet are the ground. But sometimes in images, we can create an illusion by making them look like they're connected, especially when we're talking about two-dimensional images. Some other illusions that go with figure ground, the actual word figure ground up here, with figure being the dark letters and then ground being the white in the background. Can you see some other figure ground illusions here where you can change your perception? If you focus on the dark in this one, what do you see with the white as the background? What if you focus on the white and put the black part in the background? Here's another one down here, focus on the white, then focus on the black, and it changes your images. And here another one, focus on just the white part, and then change your perception and focus on the black. I don't want to give spoilers, but we'll talk about these in class, and I have a few more that we can look at as well. A lot of companies actually use figure ground in their logos, and we'll look at some examples of that in class. The next Gestalt principle is proximity. So our brain wants to perceive similar objects that are close together in groups. If you're in close proximity, we want to put them in groups. So for example, here we have these squares that are lying together and the circles lie together. So instead of just seeing a bunch of random circles and squares, we tend to see a plus sign with dots around it. This actually kind of blurs in with the next principle, which is similarity. And similarity says that our brain also wants to group together objects that are similar and separate dissimilar. So with proximity, it's more about that they are actually located in close proximity or in a close location. But this one also includes similarity because we tend to see the similar squares together and the similar circles together. In this one, similarity, it's all about seeing the similar compared to the dissimilar. So if you were looking at, I don't know if you recognize these candy, they're called Runts. Not one of my favorites, they're just too hard for me. But if I said to look for the limes, then when you're staring at that picture, your brain picks out the limes. Or if I said to look for the oranges may have blurred in, but now that I say oranges, you can pick them out more easily. Same thing as if you have a pocket full of change, a whole bunch of coins spread out on a table, and you're trying to find, a certain coin, you're just looking for the dimes, then your brain focuses in on dimes and kind of blurs out everything else. If you're doing a puzzle and you're looking for a certain piece, you're looking for all the pieces that have just a little bit of a blue speckle on them. You're using that Gestalt principle of similarity to find that piece over everything else. Our fourth Gestalt principle is continuity, and we tend to see continuous patterns, not disrupted ones. So for example, if we have things that are like this dot to dot, we can probably already tell that that's going to be an apple, that our brain can connect those dots for us ahead of time, that we can imagine these lines continuing on, even if they're not right here, but we can imagine what would it be like if they did continue. So our brain likes to imagine what things are like if they were connected and continuously connected. The fifth Gestalt principle is simplicity, and our brain likes to look for and perceive the simplest shapes possible. So this together is not a shape that we can identify, but instead we can say it's a circle in front of a square. So our brain wants to kind of sort things. We can't just say it's a rectangle circle, like that's not a word. We want to sort it into something that we know. Here, this is not an actual shape. It's not an actual 7. This is also an example of continuity. It's not actually connected, but our brain wants to perceive it that way. So we can say, that there's these 3 different shapes, but instead our brain wants to make it into the most simple shape possible, which is a number 7. And then our final one, let me make sure I don't have a 7th one hiding there. Right. Our final one is closure. Occurs when people see a familiar pattern or shape with some missing parts. And again, a lot of these are pretty similar in their principles because our brain does all of them at the same time. But for example, this is not actually a circle, but our brain wants to connect the dots and make it a circle for us. There's not actually a white square. There's not actually a square here, but we perceive this white square because we want to kind of fill in these areas where there's nothing there. Or you could see that there's a diamond there, even though there's not actually a diamond. There's only these little half triangles or partial triangles or Pac-Mans, but we can see circles and a square and a diamond because our brain wants to close in those images. A lot of this, so when we see a familiar pattern or shape with some missing parts. A lot of abstract art uses the Gestalt principles. You may recognize this as a Picasso painting. So Picasso, he plays on this idea that, it's not a full image, but our brain is going to kind of work a little harder to perceive it as one. Hopefully you can see that there's a violin in that image. But what about when your brain still doesn't have enough sensory input? Then it has to rely on making inferences. And you've probably had enough classes and enough English classes that talk about making inferences or making judgments about a situation based on the other information that you do have. So perceptual inferences are when we don't have enough sensory information, but our brain has to fill in the gaps in what our senses are telling us. So for example, this road here, we cannot see what happens to the road when it goes around this cliff. Now, we're going to infer that the road keeps going. The first time we drive down this road, we're going to use caution because we don't actually know. Is there a stop sign right there? Is there another sharp curve? What is it like right there? So we have to be careful because we have never used that road before. So we don't have any sensory input there. But after we've traveled this road more than once, then now we have enough information for a perceptual set. Our past experiences said this road just keeps going. You have a straightaway after this. It's okay. Perceptual inference also works with things like hearing sounds, hearing a dog bark and knowing it's a dog, even though you can't actually see it. But your perceptual set says, I've heard enough dogs bark before that I know that that's a dog barking. In fact, I know that's my own dog barking at the neighbor's cat. I know this sound this time of day. So perceptual inference is when we don't have the sensory information yet, and we just have to make a judgment call. Once we've had that experience, then our perceptual set is kind of more based on the experience that we've already had. All right, that's it for 3-6, perception and Gestalt.